Kia ora, welcome to Under the Checkered Flag, MotoGP edition. I'm your host Kate, and we're just going to jump right in. So I am going to start by saying hello, because if you are watching the YouTube version of this, you will be able to see my face. So I've been toying with this idea for a few weeks now, about whether I should include my face, because, I don't know, it gives something for people to look at other than photos, because I have not yet managed to wear Dorna down to be able to get access to those short video clips that I'm still trying, I promise you. I am still trying, and maybe one day they will actually let me use very small video clips for this podcast, but until then, we'll just do probably this, a video little square Kate inside. And while you are here, I'm going to introduce you to my puppy. This is Lewis. He's a little angel, a little nightmare angel, I'll admit, but he is a fox terrier and he is probably 10 months old now. And when you hear him tip-tapping around, you can now picture him. If I go that way, this is him. He's a good boy. He lives for treats and belly rubs. So, today's podcast, I'm going to be discussing the concession rules that we've seen in the news lately. I'm just going to be discussing other rules as well, such as towing and whether that should be banned or not. I'm also just going to be discussing the news around Carlos Ezpeleta saying that the ideal for them is to have 20 MotoGP bikes on the grid. So, we will start with the concession rules. So, Ezpeleta came out this weekend and said, we are working on being able to help not only Honda, but also Yamaha, that they can be competitive again in a faster way. So, I am unsure about whether I want this or not, whether I think that the Japanese manufacturers deserve concessions at all, because we know that Honda especially have the resources and the finances to be able to become competitive again. And, realistically, the Japanese manufacturers need a culture shift more than they need concessions. Their big problem seems to be that they're not willing to test parts during a race weekend, and with this new format, with no free practice really, or one very short free practice session, they don't have time to check and test parts on the grid, so they're stuck doing it back in their factories back in Japan, and I find that's really not going to help them move forward. And so I thought that the best way to go about this would be to, rather than concessions, is to change back to that format of at least free practice on Friday, and then do sort of like a Saturday, I'm going to call it a Saturday shootout. I'm sorry for the Formula One reference there, but having Saturday be all about the practice session on Saturday, getting them into Q2, and having that Friday format of practice on the Saturday. I know that we want to get fans onto the track and we want people to watch as much MotoGP as possible. He's just trying to nibble my hand at the moment, my dog. So, yes, this is owning a puppy for you. However, Dorna did put the format change to the manufacturers. Why they did this, I have absolutely no idea, and I think it's a disgusting decision, because it was the riders who wanted this format change. The riders asked for this format change, and Dorna gave it to the manufacturers, and then Ducati management said no. Because of course Ducati management are going to say no, because they're there to make money, they're there to be the best bike on the grid. And if they change the format to free practice, it gives the other manufacturers time to catch up. I think it was an incredibly selfish decision, especially because this does involve rider safety, which I do believe should be paramount, because the riders are on the limit for the entire weekend now, from Friday all the way through to Sunday. And it's not something that I do think is sustainable long term. And I really do worry that it is going to take a fatality to get this change, the format changed even slightly. So I've done quite a bit of research in the last day and a half around what sort of concessions would be being offered to Yamaha and Honda. I haven't been able to find out much. So basically this announcement was made and we didn't receive any details. I'm sure that the manufacturers know a lot more than we do. And it should be noted that neither Honda or Yamaha have benefited from concessions previously. In fact, Ezpeleta said Honda and Yamaha were very considerate with the concession rules in the past, and it was vital for Ducati to be competitive and also for Suzuki to be competitive so quickly, and for KTM and Aprilia to officially enter the World Championship and be competitive as well. Dorna's official position is that the concession system should be updated. Now, I do agree that the concession system should be updated. I believe that because if you read the rules, and I will link the rules below so that anyone can read them if they choose to do so, it does seem to be that it would take an awful long time for manufacturers to qualify for concessions. And technically, if you do read the rules, no one should qualify for concessions, because to qualify at the moment you need to be a new entrant since 2013, which would automatically rule out all the current manufacturers. And we may see a situation in the future where we've got like Honda and Yamaha at the moment being so far behind. Even though Rins did win at COTA, that is definitely an outlier, because Rins is good at COTA, the Honda's good at COTA, and COTA is not your standard track. So aside from anomalies like that, we haven't seen any Honda podiums this year. We have seen more competitiveness from the Yamaha. However, they do still only have 2 bikes on the grid. And so I think long term, I do agree with Dorna in this sense that we do need to look at having those rules updated. Personally, I think they especially need updating around aerodynamics, because that is such a big player in MotoGP at the moment, and I can't see us moving away from aerodynamics ever again. They're in MotoGP now. I think they always will be, and I for one do like seeing the advancements in technology just as much as I like seeing the racing. However, I also do believe that we should be looking at the rules around aerodynamics, because I think we are going to get to the point relatively soon where we need to limit them for the sake of the racing. So it's quite clear that the Japanese manufacturers are further behind on aerodynamics. It does seem to be that there was a communication breakdown between the Japanese manufacturers and Dorna and the FIM, because Dorna hasn't really made a decision about what they want the future of MotoGP to be, whether they want it to be the Formula 1 style with aerodynamics and margins so close that you can't, or you really struggle to overtake, because we are seeing a lot of it in the racing, and it seems to be especially heightened this season, where the only time to overtake is right at the start in the first opening laps, and then basically the positions are decided. We saw that Fabio Quartararo couldn't get past Brad Binder in the most recent race. Fortunately for Fabio Quartararo, Binder exceeded those track limits and he did get the podium, but he was stuck behind him for so long, and it was the same with Aleix Espargaro and Jorge Martin. We're not seeing that overtaking, and we're not seeing that competitiveness, and it does seem to be more and more that the bike is making a much bigger difference than, say, in the early 2000s. And back then it seemed to be that the riders, the pilots, they made the most difference to the positioning and things like that. You could put a pilot on a bike and they could just blow away the competition if they were that talented. However, we're definitely, in my opinion, seeing less of that now. I do think that's something that I would like to be made more public and more aware of, so that we could have more discussion about whether we do want to continue down the route of aerodynamics, or if we do want to introduce some limitations, such as length of wings, how far off the bike they can extend, and regulations around where you can place them even more than you do at the moment, because there are only limits on certain areas of the bike. And again, I will link the rules down below so that people can make their own decisions on that, because it's a tough one. I know that I consider MotoGP to be the greatest racing series there is. When I say MotoGP, I do include the lower engine sizes, or the smaller engines, so Moto3 and Moto2, because if you've listened to my pod before, I am a massive, massive fan of Moto3. I consider it to be the most fun racing series to watch. It can be a bit sketchy because they are so young and inexperienced. However, I enjoy watching it the most because there's so many overtakes, and it does have that unpredictability that you don't, especially not at the moment, that you don't get that in MotoGP. You generally know it's going to be the Ducatis at the top, sprinkling of KTM if we're lucky, and yeah, it doesn't have as much excitement for me as Moto3, and so I do encourage everyone to watch Moto3. So on to my next point for discussion for the rules. Another rule that I think should be discussed is the rule around towing. So I, for one, do not believe it should be banned. I quite enjoy seeing Marc Marquez's antics and how he manages to wind up Pecco Bagnaia even when he's not trying to follow him. Excuse me. Still got the aches of my sickness. Hopefully this week I'll be able to get it all the way out, but we'll see. Sorry, I digress. Yes, towing. So I don't think it should be banned, especially not in MotoGP, because they have the skill to be able to tow and use that as a strategy if they choose to do so. I'm not so sure about Moto3 and Moto2 because it does require so much skill to tow. And then that raises the question in my mind as to whether it is up to MotoGP to set the rules for Moto2 and Moto3, or if we go in the other direction of Moto3 has the strictest rules and then they ease up as you go to Moto2, because obviously with Moto3 you're generally talking the younger riders, the riders who are just coming into racing, and so they wouldn't have the same skill set that they do have in MotoGP. It is obvious that people in Moto3 will be watching people in MotoGP and wanting to copy some of the strategies and things that they do. And so I think that in that sense, we should be penalising Moto3 a lot harsher than we penalise MotoGP, because it does need to take into account the skill difference and the experience on a bike, as well as the natural talent that you do see come through in Moto3. But I do think that I would prefer that style of rule making where Moto3 has the really harsh rules, and as you gain that experience and move up through the engine sizes, you can have more lenient rules and based on more of a, not a trust system, but sort of like bouncing the rules off the other riders who have the same skill level as you, because at that point they're generally a lot more mature as they're coming into MotoGP. They're going to be, with these new age limits, generally around 20 at least, and so I think that that is a much preferred way to progress. And personally, to be quite frank, I believe this is a bit of a cop-out from Dorna. I believe they've said this purely because they have no way to attract a new manufacturer to MotoGP, which I think says a lot about the current state of MotoGP. And there's a reason that I included the rant word in this title, because we all know I like to rant about Dorna, and this is going to be one of those times. I cannot understand why, when Formula One success is so magnificent at the moment, thanks to Drive to Survive as one of the big players in that, and I cannot understand why MotoGP is still struggling so much when the racing quality in all of the engine sizes and classes of MotoGP and motorcycle racing is so much closer, it's so much more exciting, it's so much more unpredictable, and we are still sitting here trying desperately to attract fans. I know that car racing is always going to have a lot more appeal to a lot more people due to the fact that a lot more people drive cars. But it doesn't seem that we are capitalising as a sport as much as we should be from the current rise in all the motorsports popularities. So we're seeing rises in NASCAR, we're seeing rises in popularity in IndyCar, we're seeing it in all the 24-hour enduro car racing, but we're really struggling in motorcycle racing, and I do believe part of that is thanks to Dorna being in charge of the sport. I do believe that they, quite frankly, yeeted them out of there, that we would, and put actual people who seem to, qualified people who haven't got into their position through word of mouth, someone. At the moment in my job, quite a few people have received their positions because of who they know, and while they do have the skill sets that would be a requirement in their job, I personally believe that people should be hired based on their skill set more than who they know. And I do believe it's a very fine balance. And I do believe that in MotoGP and in Dorna, they are struggling with that a bit more due to their policy of seeming to hire people they know rather than sourcing outside. And we did see it with the CCO coming into MotoGP, that there is a bit of a culture shift happening. However, it's not happening fast enough. And I do believe that we've got a very limited window here where the popularity of motorsport is going to continue to increase. And I think we need to capitalise on that for MotoGP as soon as possible. And I don't think it's being done quickly enough. And I think that only them Dorna coming out and saying that 20 bikes on the grid is their ideal just shows that they are failing to sell MotoGP to manufacturers, because we do want another manufacturer. And if we got another manufacturer, 24 bikes would be ideal. In an ideal world, we would have 6 manufacturers all having 4 bikes on the grid, so a factory team and a satellite team. And for Dorna to come out and say 20 bikes is their ideal is a bit of a cop-out, and it shows that they're not able to attract Kawasaki or BMW into the pinnacle, into the prototype racing of MotoGP. So they've sort of just given up, in my opinion, and they're trying to make themselves look good, frankly. And that's simply not good enough. We want another manufacturer as fans. We want 24 bikes on the grid. When we lost Suzuki, it was devastating. I'm still gutted. I know many fans still are, because they were competing so well, and when they left, they were winning races. And so we do need to think what we can do to attract more manufacturers, and I do think it comes back to getting more people to view, but I don't think Dorna realised that people aren't going to dedicate an entire weekend to watch motorcycle racing. People aren't like me, like absolute fanatics, who watch every session of every weekend. I'll do that even if those Friday sessions aren't timed, because I simply like bike. We all like bike, the people who watch every session, and we are the same people who are annoyed that the Moto2 practice is not advertised and it's not shown even on Video Pass. They do not show it. It is ridiculous. I pay for bike. I want bike. I want every session of bike, including Moto2. I know Dorna don't want to advertise Moto2, probably because they don't want Moto2 to become a thing, but the fact is, it's quite fun to watch. Aside from the noise of the wee, it's really fun to watch Moto2, because again, you've got that unpredictability, and while all the bikes there are the same, We don't want that in MotoGP. We do want them to be close, but we want the manufacturers to have sort of an even playing field as well. I say we. I do need to disclose this is my personal opinion and what I want, because I would like the factory and then the satellite team, and then that would just be the entire package for each manufacturer. Because one thing they didn't note in that same interview was, sure, they want 20 bikes on the grid, but are 8 of them going to still be Ducatis? Because that's just... I know there's a lot of debate, especially in the Discord server, about whether we do have a Ducati Cup. I, for one, think we do. I would like to see the rule changed so that there are a maximum number of bikes on the grid. I would like to see it so each team is required to have a satellite team, so Yamaha would have a satellite. And then I do believe that we should have a maximum of 6 bikes per manufacturer. I know that we can look back and say when Honda were dominant, they had heaps of bikes on the grid. What's different now? The difference is now, to me, we don't want this to become the norm. We shouldn't look back at the past and say, oh, it was okay then. Why is it not okay now? It's more the fact that it wasn't okay then, it's not okay now, and moving forward, I do want to be able to see a more even playing field rather than knowing with pretty much 100% certainty that a Ducati is going to be on the podium every single race this year. A Ducati is going to win the World Championship. Sure, it is exciting that we don't know which Ducati is going to win the race, which Ducatis are going to podium. But the fact is, we know it's going to be a Ducati, and that does take away a hint of excitement, in the same way that we know that Max Verstappen's going to win the championship in Formula 1. Sure, I love the racing for P2, P3, and the midfield. I love all the racing. But people aren't all like me. People don't want to know who's going to win the race. They don't want to know what manufacturer is going to win the race or what manufacturer is going to win the championship. We want more surprises. We want the Moto3 style to come up into MotoGP. And I do think that that is something that if we settle for 5 manufacturers and 20 bikes, because that's what we seem to be doing, settling. We should not be settling. MotoGP is so much fun. It has so much room to growth. We should absolutely not settle for 5 manufacturers. We should be doing whatever we can to attract Triumph, whatever we could to attract Husqvarna, whatever we could to attract BMW. We need to be enticing another manufacturer to come so that we can add some more bikes to the grid. We can remove some of that Ducati domination to keep all the manufacturers on the playing field of being able to compete, in my opinion. I would prefer that rule change and the format rule change rather than just granting concessions to manufacturers who I believe just need a culture shift rather than a handout, in my opinion. All opinions my own. They do not belong to anyone else, obviously, because they're coming out of my mouth and out of my brain. And on the topic of the manufacturers, one other rule that I do believe needs changing now is the one for constructors. I do believe that with 8 bikes on the grid, the constructors rule does need to be adjusted to maybe give a certain percentage of points based on how many bikes are on the grid, just so that way Ducati aren't just going to walk away with the Constructors' Championship, because we know, yes, they have built the best bike. I don't doubt that. I also don't doubt the fact that they have worked incredibly hard and put the hours and the money into building that bike. However, with the 8 bikes on the grid, it should, in my opinion, be adjusted to balance out so that when a Yamaha does get on the podium, it is reflected that one of only 2 bikes on the grid got on the podium rather than one of 8. So if it works out that we just divide the amount of points that Ducati get for each podium by 8, and we do it for KTM by 4 and Yamaha by 2, something like that could be considered, just because it doesn't seem fair that Fabio Quartararo can power through and break up those Ducatis and podium, and he's doing it on a Yamaha, and there's only 2 of those, so there's no ability to help out your teammates, help out your competitors who are still on the same bike as you. Yes, we don't run with team orders or things like that generally in MotoGP. We haven't done in a long while. In recent memory, I can't think of anything off the top of my head except maybe Jorge Lorenzo completely just ignoring Ducati's team orders, which sort of proves the point that we don't like team orders. We think it's a bit cheap. Well, again, I think it's a bit cheap. It's basically manipulating a championship, and it's not something that I want to see in my favourite sport. And I think that we should be looking at how we do adjust those rules because of the amount of Ducatis that we have on the grid. Whether that is a rule that should be adjusted or not, I don't know. I wouldn't know how to put it in because this thought has just popped into my head. I haven't really pre-thought anything in regards to what we could replace that with the exception of dividing it by the amount of bikes on the grid, which doesn't really seem like the correct way to do things, but it's just throwing something out there to the floor because at the moment we know Ducati's won the championship, and we also know that KTM probably deserves more points for where they're placing in among all those Ducatis. And yeah, it's just another one of those little quirky rules that I'm not really okay with at the moment. Again, this is a little bit of a shorter episode just because I'm still not feeling 100% and my brain is still a bit muddled from the flu and the meds for the flu. So I am trying to keep them around 30 to 40 minutes. I think that's because I like listening to podcasts at 30 to 40 minutes. If you do think it should be shorter or longer, let me know, and I will adjust accordingly. Also, do flick me a message in the Discord server, or my email's available on, if you click through to the profile, just about whether I should include my face in these or not. Obviously, if you're listening to the podcast format of this, please totally disregard that. So thank you for listening to me ramble about those things. I tried my best to stay on topic. Today is the first podcast I've released when we haven't had a race at the weekend, or we don't have one coming up. In fact, just before this, I jumped on the MotoGP website and had a look at how long we have to wait until the next race. At the time of recording, we have 32 days, 10 hours, 51 minutes and 12 seconds to wait. It's a very long break, it seems. We did lose Kazakhstan, which I'm not surprised about, and realistically the track works haven't started in India, so while we do have tickets on sale for that race, I'm a little bit sceptical as to whether it's going to go ahead because those works haven't started. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for India because I know a lot of people will be going to it and it will be really good. I really like the look of that track, and I think it'll be quite a balanced track with some of the corners. It does have a really big straight, which some people who have been playing the video game have told me. It's a very long straight, and so obviously that will benefit the Ducatis, and so that will be quite interesting to see. So thank you all for watching. I'm hoping that you enjoyed the cameos by my dog, who is now currently asleep on the sofa. Obviously he wore himself out featuring in this episode. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe if you feel like it, and I will be back next Monday to ramble a bit more about MotoGP because apparently I just really like talking about MotoGP, which doesn't surprise me in the slightest because it is such a wonderful sport. Thank you. Have a lovely week.